Hi, I'm Dr. Gemma Newman, your host for the Wellness Edit podcast with Holland and Barrett, and author of The Plant Power Doctor, coming out in January 2021. In this episode of our brand new podcast, we're going to be talking about happiness. Now, this has been a tremendously challenging year for the majority of people, so we thought we'd end the series on a high and talk about ways in which we can all start to improve our own happiness. To join me for this fascinating conversation, we have Owen O'Kane. He is a motivational speaker, he's a therapist, and he's best-selling author of 2 books, 10 to Zen and 10 Times Happier. And it is absolutely fabulous to have you joining me today, Owen. Hello.
Hello, and thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Oh, it's a joy. And I think throughout this podcast series, we've done a job in really trying to help people figure out ways in which to optimize their health and well-being. And at this stage, I think it's really important to talk about happiness, because this is something that people have really struggled with this year. Yeah. What have you found in your experience? Has this been a challenging year for people in your experience?
I think it has. I mean, it's you know, I know this has been said before, but there's no roadmap. You know, we weren't really prepared for the year, and nobody really had a solution. And I was thinking about, you know, my book. I'd finished the book about a year ago, and the book is about happiness, but not happiness in the kind of fluffy, airy fairy way. It's about, you know, how can we be human, you know, as human beings, how can we be happier? And I believe most of us can be much happier than we are, but often we don't realize that because we create the kind of obstructions and blocks in our life. But then, of course, lockdown happened when in the external world there were a load of challenges that would justifiably explain why people wouldn't be happy. And yeah, I was a bit doubtful about releasing a book on happiness in the middle of all of the chaos. But then I had a really interesting conversation with my dad. My dad's, he was a builder and, you know, just a very everyday bloke. And I said, maybe I should hold fire and not release a book. And he said, well, tell me more about the book. What's it about? And I said, well, it's about happiness and how people can be happier. And he said, why on earth would you delay bringing out a book? This is when people are going to need the book. And interestingly, in that moment, I thought, he's right. I'm not going to hold back. So the book's come out. Thankfully, you know, it's been received really well. But more importantly, I think it is helping people navigate their way through some difficult times.
Absolutely. And I think you're so right. We need that kind of information now more than ever. I think It is natural for many people to feel more stressed at a time like this, you know, with the increased anxiety and lack of certainty and feeling that we're out of control. So, yeah, I do think that it's probably the perfect time to have released something like this. And before we get into your tips and ideas, I would just really love to learn a little bit more about your own happiness journey and why it is that you were able to write this book. What did it mean to you and where did it all begin?
So my background's split. So half of my background was in health, and then halfway through my career, I retrained in psychotherapy. So I'd spent about 10 years of my career working with people who were terminally ill. And I loved that work. I was really interested in the work. But I got to a point and I realized that what most people were struggling with was psychological distress. And I had all the medical information, but I didn't have the tools to manage their psychological distress. So I went off and retrained. So the second half of my career, I retrained as a psychotherapist, was a clinical lead in the NHS, and I was doing workshops and talks, and I created my first book was called 10 to Zen, and it was teaching people how to quieten the mind in 10 minutes a day. I suppose my argument is that people don't have a lot of time. So I didn't want to create a concept or write a book where people have to spend an hour or 2 hours every day. So I wanted to create a concept that was practical and useful. And I'm also really interested in happiness, because most people, I would say 99% of people that come to therapy, when you say to them, what would you like from therapy? They either say, I just want to feel better, or I'd like to be a bit happier. I mean, and that's kind of universal. And I got really interested in happiness, and in my own life, I know what brings me happiness. The simpler I keep my life, the happier I am. And the less, you know, I just kind of, and I think often we can create our own complications. So for me, it's about kind of, you know, reducing everything down a few notches and creating more simplicity. But I also realize that most people get in the way of their own happiness and they don't realize they're doing it. And that's what I'm really interested in. And that's what motivated me to write the book. And the 10 chapters then cover the 10 areas where I see people get stuck over and over and over again.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah. I really love what you said about simplicity. So not only do we tend to overcomplicate our minds and our emotions and our personal situations, but also as therapists, as doctors, we may also sometimes overcomplicate the journey to feeling better. So for you to come up with a concept that actually helps people within 10 minutes begin that process of feeling better makes it so much more accessible to all of us. So yeah, I love the idea of keeping it simple, because, you know, there are so many ways in which we could try and think, oh, well, I've got to find my identity. I've got to find purpose. I've got to live with intention. I've got to breathe. I've got to have a routine. I've got to nurture my relationships. I've got to be the best I can at work. I've got to give service to others. And then by the time you've got through this entire list of things, you're definitely not happy.
You're exhausted, exactly. And that's the thing, really. It's about, you know, how do you reprioritize? What are the things in life that are important? What does matter? What helps you function better? Because certainly as a therapist, how I work is that we're never going to sort out all of the issues in our life, you know, regardless of whether it's stuff in the past. And we don't have a lot of control over what's going to come next. So it's about, well, how can we function better? How can we on a day-to-day basis manage our minds better, change our perspective, and I suppose really just, you know, approach life with a lot more curiosity and openness. And I think it's been really interesting for me because, of course, lockdown, you know, challenges all of that. And for me, what's been fascinating is I've been really forced to practice what I preach, because I don't like uncertainty either. I like a list, I like a plan, I like to know what I'm doing. And suddenly, like everyone else, you know, all of my plans changed very quickly. I was releasing a book in a pandemic. All of my talks and workshops were online. I'm technophobic. So you know, suddenly I had to navigate this new world. But actually I thought, you know something, I don't have any control over this. So all I can do is respond in the best way I can, which is managing this one step at a time and just taking that as it comes. And it works.
Yeah, it does work. And I think the pandemic has really brought us home to the idea that in actual fact, we're not ever necessarily really in full control of the events of our lives. No. And having to understand that deeply and then relinquish the idea of control and then be able to mentally, emotionally, spiritually accept that the only thing we do have control over is our responses to the events around us. It's actually tremendously freeing, but it's a process, and it can sometimes involve pain as well, can't it?
Hard work. I was saying to a client of mine a few days ago, if you look at a definition of anxiety, it's an intolerance of uncertainty. So that's a textbook definition right. From a psychology perspective. So there's a big clue in that, really. So if you're intolerant of uncertainty, you're going to become more anxious. And the more tolerant you can become with the uncertainty, then your level of anxiety is going to drop. And that's certainly clinically something I do in my work when I'm with people and I'm in a room with them. It's about, can you be more tolerant with the fact that you don't know? And that there isn't predictability and there isn't certainty, and maybe just trust that you will manage whatever the next step is. And I think what I see a lot of people doing at the moment is, you know, they're almost kind of spinning 10, 15 plates at the one time, trying to work it all out. When's it going to be a vaccine? When's it going to end? What's going to happen to my job? And for me, it's about, okay, what one thing can you manage today? You know, what one thing can you deal with today that gives you a sense of control? Maybe focus on that. And then all the other stuff, I'm not saying that you deny it's there, but you can park it and just leave it be and think, okay, well, that's not in my control today, but I am going to focus on the one thing or two things that I do have a bit of control over. And then suddenly you can see people feeling a sense of relief. But they're not having to juggle it all at one time and say, okay, well, this can be enough for today. And then the other stuff I'll think about. So, you know, I think it really is about perspective.
That's really valuable to think about, because it can feel very overwhelming when you are contemplating all the things that have changed. Say, for example, you had the virus yourself, or you had an ill loved one, or you had someone who was immunocompromised, or you've lost your job, or you were in furlough and you don't know what's going to happen next, or, your children were having to be homeschooled, and then there's the risk of them having to go back home for a week or 2 or 3 or however many weeks. All of these different things, everybody has a very different experience, but I think there's this collective experience of uncertainty, which, as you say, this isn't a panacea. Finding a way to be happier, or at least be more comfortable with uncertainty, is not going to solve all your problems. But there's, as you've pointed out, it's a way of being able to understand that everything that is in existence, to notice it, to be aware of it, but also not to become overwhelmed by the seeming enormity of it all.
Yeah, you make a brilliant point, because everything you've mentioned there, they're all external circumstances. Every single thing that's going on in people's worlds, it's all going on in the external world. And I suppose my argument is, and it's not minimizing any of that, because, I hear this probably like you. I'm hearing the horror stories every day of the week of what's going on in people's lives. But we may not be able to control the external stuff, but I do think the one thing that you do have control over is you can control the internal world. And if you can learn how to quieten your mind, if you can learn how to manage unhelpful, anxious, critical thinking, if you can learn how to manage that sense of overwhelm, well, it just means then that all of the stuff that's going on in the external world, even though it might be challenging and difficult, it just means you're coming from a much more solid base than you would be if you suddenly enter into the chaos. So it really isn't fairy dust magical happy thinking it's all going to be okay. It really is about taking control and taking ownership, and kind of feeling quite rooted, because then suddenly you'll cope much better.
Yeah. So feeling rooted, taking ownership of your internal world. Yeah. How do we do this, Owen? How? Tell us.
That's all in the book. It's all in the book. I think it's a process of a lot of things, but I always come back to the neuroscience of the brain. Really, if you think of this organ that sits in the top of your head, it's a piece of jelly, and it's the epicenter for everything that goes on. And I think a lot of the time we take the information from the brain as a given. We take it for granted. So, for example, I heard someone say to me yesterday, in fact, I'm just a warrior. That's just who I am. And I thought, well, actually, it's not who you are. It's an aspect of your personality, but you've got a brain that functions in a particular way that's not helpful for you. And I think very often what the neuroscientists are telling us more and more and more is that if you've got a highly activated threat system, so there's a part of the brain on the right-hand side, as called the amygdala, and when that's highly activated or it's overactivated, then you're going to feel that sense of threat and worry. So one of the key techniques is really stuff like using the breath, meditation, learning to quieten the noise in the mind. Stuff like meditation. People, when they hear the word meditation, get a little bit freaked, but meditation helps quieten the noise. It helps regulate the mind. If you think of our neural pathways, when we're in an anxious state, these neural pathways are chaotic, and yet meditation, just bringing your attention to your point of focus, helps retrain the brain, quietens the noise, regulates the neural pathways, and suddenly then what you get is you get a brain that functions better for you, rather than feel like it's in chaos mode. And I'm always struck by that every time I just stop to breathe or meditate.
Yeah.
No matter how frantic it can feel, just that stopping, even for a minute or two, just to catch your breath and come into the present moment, suddenly can just reduce all of the chaos that goes on in the mind.
I like that, reducing the chaos. And it feels a little bit like that in 2020. I've called it the coronavirus carousel, where people are just kind of going round and round, watching the news, watching the death rates, watching the hospitalizations, watching all the negative things that are happening, and then just taking a moment to jump off that carousel and watch it as it spins, and just notice what's happening, but not to try to get yourself too caught up in it all, can be tremendously helpful. And I really like the point that you made about how the brain works, because genuinely, our brains are not designed, actually, I don't think, to keep us happy. Our brains are designed to keep us safe. And so, you know, as you've pointed out, if someone's got a highly active amygdala, that threat center is going to be very much activated. We're going to have a general negativity bias, especially based on perhaps previous experiences. And that's a natural mechanism to keep you alive and to keep you safe. But as you said, it's not always that helpful. And if we can tune into things like you mentioned meditation, you mentioned the breath. Those are things that can then activate the parasympathetic nervous system, our rest and renew, and actually help us to feel a little bit more functional. Is that right?
Exactly. And even, you know, obviously even in the world of food and diet and nutrition and stuff, I mean, you guys are experts in these fields. You know, when you go outside of the world of psychology and you hear what the other experts are telling us, even the foods that we eat can increase our inflammatory markers. And I often think that anxiety is an inflammatory response, you know, and I think even thinking about the foods that we put into your body, you know, the supplements we take, exercise. I mean, there's been a mountain of research on getting out there, even if it's for 10, 15 minutes, going for a brisk walk. What we know is that increased serotonin reuptake can improve oxytocin, increase our dopamine levels. So, I mean, the interesting thing is when we talk when we talk about the well-being measures that we can use, food, exercise, meditation, using the breath, whatever it is that works for you, there's enough scientific evidence to back up the fact that this stuff is really, really useful, because you can change the chemistry of your mind. You can change what level of hormones are secreted and stuff. So it's not worldly. This stuff is really, really important. So when I talk about ownership, it really is about encouraging people. The more you can take ownership for your own health and well-being, then not only are you going to feel well physically, but actually mentally you're going to cope and you're going to function so much better.
It's really good advice. And I guess sometimes that advice could be perhaps misinterpreted by somebody who's having, you know, a really rough time. Say somebody who's been tremendously ill, they've got a huge amount of external stressors. How can they receive that information in a way that helps them to feel good about it, helps them to feel as though, you know, there's something I can actually do, rather than thinking, oh, there's another thing that I'm expected to have to take on here. There's another thing and, oh, it's my fault. How can somebody kind of shift that so that it becomes really useful to them in their lives?
It's a good point, actually. And I think what you've often got to do is, you know, certainly in our line of work and in my line of work, you're really trying to encourage people and you're trying to promote techniques and ways of living that, you know, work. And, you know, I think sometimes giving people too much information at one time, it's tricky and it's difficult. So I'll often say to people, you know, maybe just start with one thing, you know, give it a go. Try it out, see what difference it makes. And I think experientially, once people realize something is helpful for them and they start to feel a bit better, and you know, my argument will always be, even if you feel slightly better, I always use a 0 to 10 scale, you know. I think even if you've gone up a point and you're feeling slightly better, or your anxiety's dropped a point, that's a pretty good indicator that this is a positive choice for you. So I think it's about giving enough information where it's clear that this is driven by evidence and not just something that we make up. Because I think there's a danger in the world of health that some of it can just feel like it's abstract. So I think it's about making it relevant, explaining the evidence, but in everyday language, not scientific language, just about explaining it. And, you know, bringing it alive, I suppose, and taking it bit by bit and step by step, rather than it feeling like another task or another thing to do.
So essentially, it's really beneficial then to focus on small steps to feeling better, rather than necessarily trying to take on some big changes.
I think so, because I think that, you know, feeling better in the world of health, you know, we know that there aren't any magic wand solutions to feeling better quickly. We know that at the moment in life, things are chaotic, things are challenging, things are difficult. There isn't a magic wand solution. But I do believe sometimes that, you know, go back to that point about simplicity, one single action in your day. So I'll give you an example. Yesterday I had a really stressful day. I just had lots of things going on at one point. And at one point yesterday afternoon, I stopped literally for 2-3 minutes, with a cup of tea, and I just sat in the back garden. And it was 2-3 minutes of my day, but I just did nothing. I just sat looking at a tree, drinking a cup of tea. And I come back and I had loads of other things to do, but I genuinely felt better.
Yeah.
Because I'd stepped out and I just allowed that moment for the mind to quieten, and I just allowed my perspective to go somewhere else rather than, it's a bit like quicksand, isn't it? The more we get absorbed in the day, it's like you suddenly feel yourself going on this downhill slope, and then suddenly you're in quicksand, and that can feel gunky and messy and like you're stuck. And I suppose the key for me is recognizing when you're on that slippery slope and beginning to spot that maybe it's time to pause or take a break or stop or catch a breath or get out and walk around the block, whatever the context is. And then suddenly you come back to that point of stability again.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point to make, because I noticed this amongst a lot of my patients who are parents, especially of young children. The idea of actually sitting down to have a cup of tea and think of nothing and look at a tree seems so self-indulgent to some people. They think, I can't possibly do that. What a waste of time.
And that is the thing that we hear all the time. I mean, every client, when you think about it, and here's the interesting thing for me. We all operate from 3 key systems. You've got your threat drive, which is your anxiety mechanisms. You've got your soothing drive, which is kind of self-care. And then you've kind of got that other part of it, which is more about ambition, driving forward. So you've got these 3 mechanisms playing out at any one given time. And most people I meet in my clinical work, they will come along and their threat systems are very, very acutely developed. So they know how to manage. Well, they know how to use anxiety very effectively, but not always in a good way. People's drive systems are very, very developed. So they know how to achieve, succeed, achieve more, do more. That's their drive system. But then when you come to the other system, which is soothing, how do you self-soothe? What do you do in a tough moment? What do you do when you're feeling overwhelmed? What I find is most people come and they have no idea where to start, because that's not something we're taught. Hard to soothe, hard to reassure yourself, hard to quieten the critical voice in your mind. So when people are a bit skeptical with me about self-care and taking a moment out or catching a breath or looking at a tree, wherever it is, going for a run, my argument is that once you learn how to self-soothe, everything else falls into place because you're not reliant on other stuff. You kind of got that mechanism. So I don't really see it as a luxury. I see it as an essential, to be quite honest. I mean, if I didn't use these, tips that I talk about and techniques that I use in everyday practice, if I didn't use them in my everyday life, I wouldn't function well.
Yeah, it's so true. And learning to self-soothe. So some might say, well, actually, the way I soothe myself is having half a bottle of wine in the evenings, then having an entire bar of chocolate, then potentially maybe looking to having lots of cups of tea and coffee throughout the day to get their energy levels up, and then eating a lot of, maybe half a packet of biscuits as well to self-soothe. What do you think when people are using those kinds of self-soothing strategies? What would you say?
I mean, look, they're normal, aren't they? I mean, it's kind of, it's intuitive for us as human beings if we're having a tough day and stuff to grab a biscuit or have a glass of wine and stuff. And I'm not going to police stuff and say that it's wrong, because I think everything in life is about moderation. And my argument will always be that regardless of what you eat, whether it's a couple of drinks or whatever the context, if it's too much chocolate, I think if you're in control of it and it doesn't feel that it's getting in the way of your life, or it doesn't come with a very negative aftermath, well, then maybe that's okay some of the times. Maybe that's okay as a comfort. But where I think it gets a bit more tricky, if I'm talking to someone and they say, okay, during lockdown, I've been drinking a bottle of wine every night. Mm-hmm. And I do feel better after it, and it makes me forget, and I just escape into another world. My key question will always be is, how do you feel the next day? Mm-hmm. And then often I'll hear, I feel a bit hungover, I feel a bit rubbish, and I notice I'm not sleeping as well. So it's the kind of the payoff that often comes with, it's kind of the difference between adaptive coping strategies and maladaptive. And I think every individual has to make that decision. Okay, what for you feels like it's a reasonably healthy, useful coping strategy, and what on the other hand feels like actually this is getting a bit repetitive and I'm not sleeping, I am feeling hungover most days, I'm not thinking clearly, I'm a bit more agitated. So I think you have to measure. I know certainly, I mean, I love chocolate. I mean, it's
Me
my
too.
vice. Love it. Absolutely love chocolate. But I also do know that if I have too much of it, I do get a headache and I feel sick. And interestingly, when the high wears off of a bit of chocolate, I do know that I'm a bit grumpier than normal. So it comes with a price tag. So I'm quite good at monitoring limitations. So I think it's about people have to make the decision what feels healthy for them. But I think often the external stimuli stuff that we put into your systems, I think there are sometimes more simpler ways that actually work as effectively, if not more effectively.
Yeah.
That's here for us.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I love the way that you ask the question, because when you ask the question, both of yourself or even to somebody that you are a therapist for, then it allows them the space to actually analyze the answer.
Yeah.
Rather than saying to them, you know, that's an awful lot of alcohol, you shouldn't drink that much, or that's a lot of chocolate, are you sure you're not putting on a few pounds? You're actually giving them the opportunity and giving yourself the opportunity to ask the question. And then once you've asked the question, they can come up with the answer invariably themselves.
And that's the thing. And that's one of the chapters in the book about taking responsibility. And it sounds really, really harsh, but I really fundamentally believe that you don't develop and you don't change. You don't become happier, essentially, until that moment you take responsibility, because it's kind of in our DNA. When we're going through a tough time in life and we're struggling, the easiest thing for any of us to do is to say, well, he did that, she did that, my job's rubbish, I don't like my boss, life's too difficult. So we place all of it out there and we blame life. Now, granted, life, some of it may be warranted, but often we cannot change any of that stuff. So it is about coming back and thinking, okay, well, what can I take responsibility for? What can I do? You know, what can I take ownership for? And often that can be difficult to hear sometimes. I often describe that point of therapy as like a tug of war, you know, because it feels like suddenly you're in this middle ground of, oh, you're actually asking me to sort it out.
Well, you're letting go of your anchor. You're letting go of the thing that is the excuse as to why so many other things are going wrong. Exactly. And it's a really hard thing to do.
A hard thing to do, but the liberation and the freedom that comes with it, because then suddenly you're in control. And I think even then, if you think about anxiety, if you're taking responsibility for your life and you're taking ownership, then suddenly things don't feel as overwhelming, because you know, well, actually, no, this is down to me. This comes back to me. And then suddenly that's the one thing you can manage.
I like that. And I'm thinking about how it's been this year as well for people in all these different circumstances. Given that many of the solutions lie within us, what do you think about loneliness? A lot of people have been spending more time alone. Can that impact upon happiness, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the research is clear on this here. You know, we are hardwired to connect as human beings, regardless of personality types. It doesn't matter whether you're extroverted or introverted. We need human contact. And of course, all of the research done on touch, even, you know, a handshake, a hug, you know, a warm smile, you know, you get the hormonal surge of, again, oxytocin, dopamine, you feel better. So, of course, this year, people have been disconnected. They haven't been seeing loved ones. They haven't been able to hug people. People have been in nursing homes and not had relatives. I mean, people haven't been able to say goodbye to people. I mean, I was speaking at Cheltenham Festival last week, and regardless of threat and danger, if you take away human interaction from people, you lose something really, really significant. And I think in whatever way it's possible, within the remits of lockdowns or partial lockdowns, whatever, I think that kind of connection and communication and eye contact and touch and all of that stuff is hugely important, and finding ways, you know, often it's digital these days. I don't know about you, but I miss being in the room with people.
Oh, yes.
I really
Very much.
miss looking into people's eyes and, just feeling the energy of somebody in a room rather than digital platforms. But it's the world we're living in at the moment. But I think loneliness is a huge problem. And I feel really strongly about this, actually. I think we all have a collective responsibility about the people in our lives, people who we know are struggling, that we do try and reach out and connect and don't make it a problem for the person, but we make it a collective issue that we all take responsibility for.
Oh, you're so right, because ultimately we are all connected. So yeah, I think moving forwards with the concept of happiness, what is happiness? I mean, I know that's a really big question, but let's really dial in to say, what is being happy all about?
It's an enormous question, and I think it's an impossible one to give a full answer to, because I know what it is for me to be happy as a human being. I just, instinctively, intuitively, in the depths of my being, I know when I'm happy. And that can be just feeling a sense of contentment, feeling at ease, and feeling comfortable in my own skin. Okay, and that's what it is for me. Your idea of happiness will be something very, very different. But I believe that innately most people know when they're at a point of ease and stability and feel comfortable in their world and the world around them. And for me, I think that's what happiness is. And people define that in whatever ways. Now, of course, we label it, people think it's the oldest cliches in the book. I'll be happier when I'm richer, more famous, a better job, all of the materialistic stuff that we talk about. And I think, look, I know from my own experience, set with patients in a room every day, this does not bring happiness. It doesn't. It really is an inside job.
Okay, listeners, just to clear this up, having a nice car, having a nice house, having a good job does not bring you intrinsic happiness.
I think the desire for wanting more. I'm not saying these things are important. I think comfort and safety and security, there's nothing wrong with wanting any of these things, but I think the danger is when we rely on them as a means of being happy. And that constant, I'll be happy when I get a better job, I'll be happy when I get a bigger house, I'll be happy when I get the nice car, I'll be happier when I'm richer. It's actually a bottomless pit, because in my experience, when you're working with human beings, the next layer happens, and then there's always something else. There's always something more. And I think, it's going back to what we talked about earlier. When you look outside for happiness as a means of satisfying the inside stuff, often you're disappointed. And I think, you kind of coming to terms with the inside stuff, coming to terms with who you are as a human being, what makes you tick, what makes you happy. Are you living a life that's true to your values? And have you got the right people in your life? Are you surrounded by the right people? Are you making choices that are right for you? I think those decisions and those questions are more likely to lead you to happiness than going the external route, which is about achieving, seeking, wanting.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you bring up family, relationships, friends. Now, I guess one of the keys to happiness is having functional relationships, right? Mm-hmm. Feeling as though you're connecting with your spouse. If you are single, feeling as though you're connecting with your other loved ones, your friends, your children. But expectations also can sometimes get in the way of happiness. So how do you balance your relationships so that you're getting the most out of them, but that you're not expecting too much from them?
I mean, it depends on the context. One of the chapters in the book, as you know, is called "Hell is Other People," which I think is true, because a lot of our difficulties in life are often around conflict, either somebody in work or somebody in our family or a personal life, and I think that often you have to be really realistic about the people that you do have in your life. So, someone said something really powerful to me years ago, and I was having a difficulty with somebody in my life. I won't say who they are, but I was having a difficulty with a person in my life. And this person very wisely said to me, you do realize that your expectations of this person, rightly so, are pretty high. They're up here. But you need to realize that their capability and their ability is here. And they're
so they're
probably
always
never,
going to disappoint you. They're always going to disappoint you in that case.
and that's kind of who they are. Through no fault of their own. This is their capability. This is what they can deliver. But the whole time there's this conflict between, no, but I want them to be more. I want them to be better. I want them to be more reliable, whatever. And then you've got this dissatisfaction. And I think for me, it's, we all evaluate the people in our life and our worlds. And I think it is about kind of thinking, what are they capable of delivering? And it's also about realizing as well, is like, we're all acting out our own stuff all the time. Everyone has their issues. Everyone has their demons. Everyone has stuff going on. And the whole time in life, we're all interjecting and connecting and conflicting. And I could say something to you, and it could really, mortally offend you. And I won't know I've done it, but it could be that I've tapped on something, you might feel you might feel undervalued or underrated, or you might say something to me and I might feel, God, that was really offensive, or I felt disrespected in that moment. But you won't know my story fully and I won't know yours. So sometimes what we do is we're colliding the whole time and we're activating each other. And it's about recognizing. I was talking to somebody earlier. I think work of the premise that when you're in conflict with somebody, work of the premise that they're potentially suffering as well. I think it's a really useful way to work, because if somebody has been difficult or argumentative or tricky, work of the assumption that they've got something going on and they're struggling, and I think you'll deal with them in a much more compassionate way, rather than try to fight them back or prove them wrong or get one up on them. This is who we are as human beings. It's our instinct to fight back. Often when we do fight back, then what we get is we just get carnage.
It's very true. It's very true. I think, as soon as you come from a place of ego or wanting to be right or wanting to assert your dominance, whether it be intellectually or physically, things are not necessarily going to end well.
Yeah. Well, it's like that, when you said the importance of asking the question. I mean, not only about asking the questions broadly, but I think it's about asking ourselves the questions. And I know certainly in my own life, if I'm in a situation and I'm finding it difficult, or I'm conscious that something has bothered me, the first thing I'll always do is I'll just always go inwards and say, why is this bothering me? Because there's every possibility that it's got nothing to do with what's going on. So it's kind of like bringing it back to me and thinking, oh, actually, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed at the minute, or I was quite badly bullied as a kid when I grew up. So I kind of carried that with me into adulthood. So if I feel someone's undermining me, or they're trying to underestimate me, or in any way, there's this part of me, this wounded part of me, that will recognize that even as an adult. And I need to know that, because sometimes in the context of what's going on now, it's nothing, it's not relevant. So I need to manage that rather than react from, a place of a wound, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And that's a really interesting point as well, because sometimes it can be hard to trust our initial instincts on something if it's come from a place of wounding, because your immediate amygdala threat fear response is to lash out based on that feeling from childhood, or from when you were at work and there was a work colleague that really annoyed you, or somebody reminds you of somebody who really mistreated you. And so sometimes that instinctive reaction isn't always in our favor. And that's something I suppose to also kind of reflect upon. And I like the way that you put it. It's important to look within and to ask yourself the question, what is it about this person that is triggering this feeling in me? And 9 times out of 10, it's probably nothing to do with them. And I think somebody once told me that when you have close relationships, or somebody that comes into your life and they are really winding you up, the best thing to do is to actually see, well, what is it in me that's causing this? And why am I reacting in this way?
Exactly. And, it's probably worth mentioning as well that there might be occasions when someone is just behaving badly.
Yes.
And that happens in life as well. Something we just come across people and thinking, actually, there's absolutely no need for that. But I think asking the question first and thinking, actually, no, this is not my stuff. This is just rude, or they're not respecting me, or actually, I'm not valuing myself if I put up with this. So I think it's the other side of the coin as well. I'm not saying that you be a walkover and allow people to behave badly or treat you badly, but I think it's always worth going in first to check, okay, is it my stuff? And if it's not my stuff, well, of course, then you create boundaries, or you speak to the person, or you challenge bad behavior. But, I think, that chapter about hell as other people, I think it's just about not making assumptions and, again, take responsibility for your stuff, but, try to assume human beings, we're all suffering at some level. Well, I think when we view life through that lens, suddenly just life feels a bit easier.
Yeah, I think you're right. And also, you're talking about sort of suffering in general, which has been a big theme, I suppose, of this year.
Yeah.
Hopefully, the next theme will be regeneration and, being able to rise up through these challenges. But it's made me think a bit more about social media and the role that has on happiness, on discontent, on politics, on wellness, all of the ways in which it impacts our life. I mean, do you feel like happiness, how to put this, in a time when social media is just so much a part of many people's lives, how do you think we can navigate this in a healthy way that will make us ultimately happier?
I mean, I'm going to answer this in a quite a nerdy scientific way, but I'm doing it deliberately because I think it's important. If you think about the brain again as an organ that is taking in information all of the time. So if you think of social media and kind of the media at large at the moment in terms of news and all the stuff that we hear every day, probably about 95% of what we're hearing at the moment is negative information. So it's either quite fear-driven, or it's argumentative, or it's toxic of some description. Now, our brains are like a sponge. So what they do is our brains just absorb all the information. It's like a computer program. And I just kind of think, just be really selective about what you allow your brain to be saturated with. I know certainly, look, I wasn't on social media until about 2 years ago, and I use Instagram to create content, and I find that a warm community of just being able to interact and share useful content. If I'm being really honest, sometimes I go on to some of the other forums and I just find some of the toxicity and the arguments and stuff, I just don't find it helpful. And I think, it's about being selective about what you get absorbed in. And I think as well, it's like even in the broader context, most people on social media will share the best versions of their life and the best versions of them. So most pictures are airbrushed, or life seems perfect, or the relationship seems perfect. Now the reality is, you and I both know that isn't the real world for most of us, because we all have tough moments and we all have ups and downs in our life, but we're not good at putting that stuff on there. So if you're struggling and you're feeling in any way vulnerable, and you scroll through social media and you think everyone else is having a great old time, even in lockdown, people were having a great time, it's easy then to come off thinking, oh God, I feel a bit. I mean, I sometimes I'll come off and I'm really conscious that I went on pretty happy, and then you come off and you notice a slight dip. And I'm really aware of that. And I think, okay, well, that's not really going to get any more of my time. So I think, again, it's about being selective. Even who you follow, I certainly follow people that inspire you, that lift you up.
And I think that is really hard, because if you're having a down day, you might go onto social media perhaps to cheer you up, to get that little dopamine kick. And then you end up leaving social media thinking, oh, I've just filled myself with resentment and comparison and arguments. And that wasn't such a great idea, actually.
I had a period when there was a lot of people I knew on furlough, and and they were because the weather was great, wasn't it? And people were out cycling and having the time of their life. Now I was busier than ever during this period, so I genuinely didn't have a day off at all during the entire period, and it was just purely, I think, because of the nature of my work and what I do. And with all of the chaos that's going on in the world. And I was conscious sometimes of going on there and feeling a little bit resentful of people who had a little bit of time off, because part of me was desiring a bit of a break, and it was just difficult to find a gap in my diary. But so you can see how easy it is, and I'm sure those people on furlough would have been delighted to be back in work, because it's not an ideal situation. But it's really interesting how the human mind can create a different narrative.
Yeah.
With a detrimental impact.
So how is it then that we can find our way from comparison to gratitude? Like, what can we do to actually reframe these emotions that it's natural to have as a human? What would be the best strategies to do that?
I think it's about, when it comes to all the comparing stuff on social media and that, I mean, I think it's about, there's a brilliant expression, and I've heard it a few times about, you may be a chapter 1 and somebody else may be a chapter 10, but it doesn't mean either is right or wrong, because your chapter 10 will come. We're all evolving at different speeds and paces all the time. And I think, I can only speak for myself as a human being. I think that if you do what's important for you in life, if you trust your own instincts and intuition, if you do what matters to you, if you surround yourself with the right people, if you trust your own values and your own judgments and you're led by them, and you just be authentic and truthful, you can't really go far wrong. And I think if you keep coming back to that and thinking it doesn't matter what they're doing, it doesn't matter what he's achieved or she's done or where she's going, it doesn't matter, because that's their journey. And it might look incredible for the other individual at the moment, but they're going to have a moment when things are tough and difficult, and then so it's all variables. And I suppose really most of my career has been on the front line of human suffering, either working with people who are dying, or certainly for the last, my career has gone over 25 years to date. Half was in health, most of it terminal care, and the rest has been in psychology and mental health. Human beings suffer and human beings struggle right across the board.
So this is an interesting point you've made. You've seen the pinnacle of human suffering in a sense, and you talked about people being in different chapters of their lives. So it's important not to compare, because where you are maybe, somewhere very different in terms of chapters to somebody else. You've talked about how to overcome these feelings and this sort of focus on the external things. When we feel life is holding us back, you may have already answered this question, but how is it that we can overcome that feeling? When we feel as though life isn't where we want it to be, what would be a good step then to move forwards?
There are a couple of things. I mean, I think the first thing is always about recognition. I think, I had an old supervisor who used to say to me, you always remember when you're working with someone that if they have awareness that they're stuck, then you're halfway there. And that's a great place to be. So I think, that awareness of where you're stuck, what's the dissatisfaction about? What is it within your life that you'd like to change? What would you like to be different? Once you can look at those questions and begin to answer them, then I think, okay, well, you're halfway there because you've got awareness. The next thing then becomes about, okay, what are you going to do about it? What's the next best step? Not, and I think this is kind of the generation we live in. We want everything sorted today and now, and we want the solution today. Well, now, what would one next step be like that gets you on that road? And what would be the plan step for tomorrow? So again, it's coming back to the kind of taking it all one step at a time, simplicity, and being really realistic about how you're going to manage things. And I also think it's also about, and it's coming back to the point about hope again. I think, like, even chemically, what we know, this, that with hope, when you're hopeful, when you adopt a hopeful perspective, you produce more enkephalins and more endorphins. So even to make a decision to be hopeful rather than pessimistic or fearful, you chemically, again, create patterns that are just helpful for your wellness. So I think even at the most basic practical level, being hopeful has its uses. But what I would say is that for anybody struggling at the minute particularly, every single thing that's happened in life so far, every war, every famine, every disaster, every catastrophe, things eventually come to an end. They don't last forever. Even this pandemic at some point will come to an end. There will be a point when we will look back and think, oh, that was a really tough period, but it does end. And I think what I choose to do is I choose to think, okay, this has really encouraged me to pause, stop, and reevaluate again. I'm conscious that a vaccine is likely to come at some point, so that will bring some degree of hope. I'm sure treatments will evolve and develop. At the moment, it's bumpy, and it's turbulent, and it feels very uncomfortable, and it feels very, very uneasy. But I choose to focus on the fact that there is another end. And the turbulence does come to an end. It's a period of time. And rather than get stuck in the awesomeness of some of the challenges now, what I choose to do is I kind of choose to accept, okay, this is going on at the moment. I may not necessarily like it. I wouldn't have chosen it. But I choose to look forward and think there is another end.
Right.
There's a way forward. And I think that can make all the difference. So the acknowledgement and the recognition, know what it is you're struggling with, know what it is you want, be clear about what direction your life would take responsibility for that. Don't apologize or don't be afraid to be hopeful. I think they're probably the top tips I would give to anyone struggling.
So staying hopeful, I think that's a really good point. Also, I'd really like to delve a little bit more into what you said about, there's two things that to me seem slightly kind of complementary to each other, but also potentially Contradictory, yes, because we've talked about the importance of staying in the now, not dwelling on past mistakes, not creating anxiety over future events, but at the same time looking forward to. So what would be the best advice in sort of staying present to what you're experiencing right now, but also looking forward to the future?
It's a great question. So there's a really useful model of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy. It very much comes to the here and now. And I think when the here and now is difficult, then the instinct is to worry about the future, because it's almost like the brain's way of thinking it can control the problem. So if it worries more about the future, then it'll sort out the difficulties in the here and now. So what I say to most people I'm working with is, look, staying in the here and now, even when it's difficult, is important, because what you do is that present moment awareness is an important thing, because it will quieten the mind. It will help you function better. You'll feel stronger. You'll feel less overwhelmed. But the looking forward with hope isn't fixating with fear, and they're two very different things. And I think when people are often driven by the future, they're driven by future-based worries, which then becomes detrimental. Because what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that you fixate all the time in the future, but what I'm saying is that you allow yourself the possibility that there's hope in the future. And it's a very, very different mechanism, because it's something then people can hold on to.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
It
Whereas
does.
Actually, if someone gets obsessed by worrying about the future and trying to control it, then there's a lack of acceptance, and then things feel very, very difficult. So I suppose ultimately what I'm talking about a lot of the time is really psychological flexibility.
Yes. So what you said there is, in order to quieten the mind, it's important to be in the present moment.
Yeah.
And in order to accept the future, looking forward with hope is a great way of doing that, rather than coming into the anxiety of what the future might hold. It's being open to possibility. It's being open to flexibility.
Yeah. I think when most people get stuck in patterns with future, it's often about worry. Often about future-based worries. And what we know from, everything, every piece of research that's been done out there is, when people live in a state of future-based worry, their mental health declines, their anxiety decreases, their mood decreases. There hasn't been a single piece of research ever that shows that if people allow themselves to hold hope as a possibility in the future, there's been no research showing that to be detrimental.
Great. That's good advice. All right. So
that's my argument.
Yeah,
I'm going to be led
it.
by the science in that one. I sound like a government advisor, but I do believe it to be true. I really do believe that to be true.
It does make instinctive sense. So for our listeners, you've talked about the importance of being in the present moment, the importance of coming back to the breath, the importance of things like meditation. What do you do if your brain has got you into a situation where you feel that there's no way out? You feel as though you cannot bring yourself back from this. What advice would you have?
I think at that point, I think what you're describing is overwhelm. And I think if someone gets to that point of overwhelm and it's impossible for them to quieten their mind, or they just feel they're unable to steady themselves, that's the point I would say talk to someone and seek a bit of help, because occasionally, and it doesn't happen all of the time, not everyone will need therapy. Not everyone will need medication. Not everyone will need professional support and help. But I think if it ever gets to a point, and there's no right or wrong in any of this here, it's a bit like, I see it like getting the flu. Not everybody with the flu will need to be off work. Some people will function well and be able to get on with it. Somebody else might be in bed for a month because it's really hit them quite hard. And I think our mental wellness can be a bit like that. And I think there's no right, there's no wrong, there's no judgment. There just may be certain periods in life when things become a bit more difficult. And I think if it becomes impossible or really challenging to self-manage, then at that point I would say, look, talk to someone. Start with a close friend, someone you trust. There are GPs, there's loads of professionals like myself out there who are trained in experience and can offer the right help. And again, it's about just keeping in mind that if it feels awful and overwhelming today, it's today. That doesn't mean it's the entire trajectory of your life. It's a period in time. And with the right help, the right support, what you're aiming to do is just bring things down. So that, when I talked about inflammation earlier, just think of it like, okay, well, the focus at the moment is about getting the inflammation down to get you back to your point of stability and strength again. And whether you can do that independently or whether you need help, it doesn't matter. The person can make that choice. Or sometimes we might watch a friend struggling and we might intervene and say, maybe now is the time to talk to someone.
Yeah. And to help be that gift in their life as well. When you can, especially, and you know what, sometimes it's the pain that we experience that allows us to be able to give that gift, and gaining that kind of perspective is also really important, isn't it?
Someone asked me a question. It was about 2 weeks ago. Someone had said about why did you wait? I'm not young anymore. I'm not in my 20s. And so I said, why did you wait until you were older to write the books? And I thought, actually, I couldn't have done that work when I was younger because I didn't have the life experience, either personally or professionally. And I think, all of our experiences in life, every single experience we have, we can use. I wouldn't do what I do. I think if I had an idyllic childhood and no problems or no challenges or no struggles, I'm not sure I would have been interested in doing what I do. But what fascinates me about the work I do is that I kind of get human suffering. I understand it not only because I see it every day in my clinical practice, but actually I know what it's like to struggle as a human being, and I actually know that doesn't feel good. But I also know that there are ways forward and that there are ways out. And I think that's all of our journeys in life, isn't it? It's about what do we learn? How do we pass that on? What do we learn? How do we pass that on? And I think that's what it's all about ultimately.
Yeah, you're right. That's such a beautiful way to finish what I consider to be a real cracker of an episode. It was a really special experience to talk it through with you and to be able to have this incredibly insightful conversation. So thank you so, so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And I hope the listeners, get something from it. If there's one word or one syllable or one sentence that's resonated, then, use that and listen to it because there's probably something in it that matters.
Absolutely. And I would encourage any listener to perhaps even listen again, have a pen and paper nearby and write down some of the things that Owen has shared and ask yourself the question. I think we can come back to that point that has been the thread that's perhaps brought this together, is to ask yourself those questions so that you can better understand yourself and better understand what it is that makes you truly happy. And, I think perhaps it would be worth ending with Owen just giving us any final thoughts about embracing happiness in this life.
I think my final thought would be, particularly at the moment, is unquestionably, I don't think there's a human being on the planet at the moment who isn't feeling unsettled or a little bit uncertain. And it's worth holding on to that. While you may not feel in control of all of the stuff that's going on in the world, all of the external stuff, the more you can bring your focus internally and take responsibility and take ownership for that and bring yourself almost into that, almost like an internal bunker, come back into that place of safety, trusting that the storm will pass eventually, that will make it so much more manageable.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Owen, for joining me today. And thank you to the listeners for joining us today. What an amazing episode and what an incredible series. I want to say thank you for joining me for this fantastic journey with the Wellness Edit with Holland and Barrett. The sad news is this was the final episode, but the good news is you'll be able to listen to all 8 episodes at any streaming platform. So whichever one is your favorite, do tune in and you can revisit some of the incredible conversations that we've had as part of this series. So thank you so much for joining us. For more health and wellness advice, visit the Health Hub at hollandandbarrett.com. All views are those of our guests and not Holland & Barrett unless explicitly stated otherwise. Any reference to brands and/or products should not be considered as an endorsement.